Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along. My name is Brendan Taylor, and on behalf of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Charles Miller. At the SDSC, we do have a long association with distinguished scholars that share the same surname as Charlie does. In fact, when SDSC, as some of you know, was very first set up, it was the brainchild of a certain Professor J.D.B. Miller, who was the head of the Department of International Relations at that time, and another Professor Miller with a different spelling, Professor Tom Miller, who became the inaugural head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. So when this bright young graduate from Duke University turned up just about a year and a half ago, we took a very close look at him, and even though he was no relation, we ended up giving him a job. And certainly we haven't been disappointed, Charlie. It's been great to have you on board, and especially some of the new and fresh techniques. I say new and fresh, well, I think I see Ian McAllister sitting down the back there, so no pressure that the kind of the doyen in this field is in the room. Thanks again for coming along, but that you've been able to bring to bear on foreign policy questions for Australia, and also defence policy questions for Australia are very, very exciting from our perspective. So very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say this evening. Goodness knows, with all of the action that's kind of going on in the foreign policy space at the moment, with the agreements being struck left, right and centre over the past few days, we need all the help that we can get trying to make sense of them. So thank you so much, Charlie, and thanks to everyone again for coming along, and very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So if you join me in welcoming Charlie to the podium.
Thank you very much, Brendan. So why do we care about this technique? Or why do we care about this topic, I should say? Right from the beginning of the study of strategy and international relations, many policymakers and many thinkers have believed that the public's views shouldn't really be taken seriously when it comes to making foreign and defence policy. They believed that the public were not informed about the issues, and they believed that foreign policy and defence policy would be much better if it were made by a small elite without reference to what the majority of people say. So I'm going to start off by giving you a couple of reasons why individuals, especially within the policy community, ought to care about the issue of public opinion in foreign policy. The first of these is purely pragmatic. The vast majority of the time, it's absolutely true that foreign and defence policy issues are not what political scientists would call salient for the majority of Australian voters. Now, by salient, I mean an issue that they really care very deeply about and is going to have a strong effect on the party that they choose to vote for. This has been established by some colleagues over in SPIR, Keith Dowding, and also Aaron Martin, who've looked at the response of Australian politicians to the public on a number of issues and come to this conclusion. However, there are those occasions on which foreign policy becomes extremely salient indeed. And in those occasions, it really is important that policymakers know what the public is thinking, and even more so that the policymakers understand why the public is thinking the way it's thinking. So in the case of the United States, starting off with 9/11, in 2004, George W. Bush's re-election has been convincingly argued was largely due to the fact he was perceived as being a strong leader in the war against terrorism, as shown in one of his campaign posters from around about that period. In 2008, foreign policy issues, and specifically the war in Iraq, might not necessarily explain why the Democrats took control of the White House again, but it probably does explain why the Democrat who took control of the White House was Barack Obama and not Hillary Clinton, whose record on the war in Iraq was viewed with distrust by many of the Democrats in base. Now here in Australia, we don't have quite as many clear-cut cases of foreign policy really shaping the outcome of the general national election, but perhaps the closest may be the election of Gough Whitlam in the early 1970s. It has been claimed by some observers that the popularity of the Liberal government when the Vietnam War was going well for the Allies, and then its declining popularity and replacement by the Labour Party in the early 1970s was due to the course of the war in Vietnam. So there's a self-interested reason for policymakers to pay attention to what the public thinks about foreign policy and defence policy. However, there's also a moral reason. And here I'm actually going to go back to my non-relative but namesake, Mr. T.B. Miller. And he says this: It's the public that pay the taxes, that pay for the bombs and the guns and the ships that our military use if it goes to war, or even if it doesn't, even just in practice. It's the public that could be asked to sacrifice their sons and daughters in wars if we have them. It's the public that would pay the price if tensions in the region were going to escalate to the point where it seriously disrupted global trade and Australia's supply lines. Therefore, I believe that public policymakers have an obligation, a moral obligation, to really take seriously what it is that the public thinks about foreign policy and the reasons for which the public holds the views that it does. So today I'm going to discuss three issues which are especially relevant today. The first of these is casualty sensitivity. Obviously, with the war in Iraq going on, this is an issue that's really important for policymakers at this point in time. The second is relations with the United States, and the third is relations with China, both of which are especially under the spotlight now that the leaders of both countries are up in Brisbane for the G20 summit. So first of all, casualty sensitivity. Now, since the end of the Cold War, a number of analysts, and certainly a large number of policymakers and pundits, have believed that the high level of sensitivity to casualties, that is, the public's belief that almost nobody should actually be killed in a war, even for reasons that they find compelling, is a major constraint on the ability of policymakers, first of all, to use military force, and secondly, on the tactics that they would use if they actually did go to war. So in the case of Iraq, for example, all of the Western countries, including Australia, are using relatively safe aerial bombing against ISIS, plus some advisors on the ground, rather than a large number of troops. Now, there are many reasons why they're deciding not to go for a large number of boots on the ground. But one of the major ones is the perception that the public simply won't take those boots on the ground, taking large numbers of casualties. Now we come to ANZUS. Now, it's been the cornerstone of Australia's defence for the last several decades, and it's likely to remain important in the future as well. However, recently, some of the polls have discovered that the younger generation of Australians appear at least to be moving away from the support for ANZUS that their parents and grandparents have shown in the past. It's an important policy question for Australia itself, and it's an important policy question for the United States too, given Australia's strategic location and many of the things that the Australian alliance offers to the United States, as well as what the United States offers to Australia. Finally, there's relations with China. Now here we see Xi Jinping, who's apparently making the offer to Australians to start moving away from what he would possibly describe as a reflexive alignment with Washington towards a policy in which Beijing's interests are given equal prominence with those of the Americans. And one of the key determinants of whether he and the Chinese will be able to achieve this objective is whether the Australian public are prepared to go along with it. And understanding whether the Australian public will be prepared to go along with it requires understanding what drives sentiment towards China today. Okay. So the structure of this talk will be as follows. First of all, I'll give you a little bit of a gentle introduction to my approach. Then I'll give you the meat and bones of my findings regarding the three main topics I'm looking at today: casualty sensitivity, ANZUS, relations with China. And then I'm going to give the bottom line, my interpretation of what these numbers mean and what they may mean for the future course of Australian public opinion and the future course of Australian foreign policy. So, I'm going to take you guys back almost 2 years now, the race between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. The polls were giving it almost a dead heat, fractional lead for Barack Obama in most cases. Of course, in the end, Obama won rather a convincing victory. Now, alongside the struggle between Obama and Romney, the Republicans, the Democrats, conservatives, and liberals, there was a parallel struggle going on in the media, and that was the pundits versus the geeks. On the one hand, we had pundits like Joe Scarborough of MSNBC's Meet the Press, a long-term, multiple-decade veteran of US politics, former congressman, media pundit, versus Nate Silver, an economist, former poker player, has absolutely no experience whatsoever of any political campaigns, never been in Congress, never run for it, never worked there, never even possibly been close to the place. And what were they saying? Well, the geeks were saying, in actual fact, if you look at this, crunch numbers very carefully, it's not even close. I remember tracking Nate Silver's blog in the run-up to the elections, 538.com. He hardly ever gave Barack Obama anything less than an 85% chance of winning. The pundits, on the other hand, were saying, Mitt Romney has momentum. This feels like a winning campaign. It really doesn't look as though Barack Obama is going to pull this out. His debate performance was terrible. You see Romney signs all over the place. The enthusiasm at Romney's meetings is palpable. You can feel it. The numbers aren't capturing it. And then you got this kind of rhetoric, essentially. The idea that people like Nate Silver and individuals who are using large-scale data analysis, quantitative analysis of polling figures, were basically ideologues, pointy heads. They didn't really understand anything about the true nitty-gritty of political campaigning. They didn't have the experience. And therefore, their confident predictions of Barack Obama's victory were going to be confounded by reality. Of course, it ended up being wrong. The geeks were right, they called it right, and the pundits, in spite of their large amount of experience, and in fairness to the pundits, they were not as biased politically as they've often been made out to be since then. The geeks won. So, what were the lessons that we draw from this? Explicit predictive models developed by analysts such as Nate Silver vastly outperformed the gut feel or the expert intuition demonstrated by the likes of Joe Scarborough or Dick Morris, the former presidential consultant for Bill Clinton. Moreover, one of the reasons why Obama won was because his ground game was so good. And one of the reasons why his ground game, I hope you guys are familiar with this term, it simply refers to your ability to get people to vote and also to get people to vote the way they want. One of the reasons why this ground game was so good was because he was taking advantage of many of the latest developments in statistical analysis of political participation in political voting to allow him to target his voters effectively and to figure out what were the best ways of getting them to actually come to the polls and vote using methods such as experiments, which we'll get to in a little bit. So what are the deeper reasons behind this? Why is it that we decide to use models and data analysis at all? There are definite costs involved, I'm not going to deny it. The costs are that it makes it harder for academics in many cases to communicate with policymakers and the public because these methods are hard to acquire. In my case, it took me 3 to 4 years of intensive training before I was fully comfortable using an awful lot of it. But the reason why we do it, the reason why we think that these costs are worth the benefits are, I would say, as follows. First of all, as one of my advisors said, you can't really trust your brains. Even if you've been studying a subject intensely for decades and decades, there are still lots of little cognitive errors or lapses that you're likely to fall into when it comes to your understanding. Okay? So the second one of these is the law of large numbers, or if we're talking about the little kind of cognitive errors that we fall into, I might well say the law of small numbers. That is, we look at a population and we try and figure out what that population is thinking. And we consult a tiny, tiny, tiny number of those people, often our friends, our family, people we bump into in the street, and assume that that tiny number of people is actually representative of the entire population. I remember talking to my parents around about the time of the Scottish independence referendum, and they were saying every single person I talked to is going to vote yes. Surely the yes vote's going to win in a landslide. But that's a tiny fraction of the population. And even if there's no bias in how you're contacting that fraction, there's still just a by pure random chance it could very well be completely unrepresentative of the country as a whole. There's also something that I call motivated bias, or rather something that other cognitive scientists have called motivated bias. It's kind of ironic that a lot of the individual pundits who said that the American election was too close to call and that Mitt Romney had a really good chance of winning were people who wanted Mitt Romney to win. This very, very often happens in many cases. We often see what we want to see, even if we're not aware of it, which makes it really, really difficult for us to correct for it. In addition to that, we have the probability of, the problem of availability bias. And by this I mean, it's really, really easy for us to think that something is much more common than it actually is, if we can easily recall instances of it happening. Okay, so for example, we might meet somebody who is a young person who's very strongly against the ANZUS Treaty or the alliance with the United States, and because that episode is so vivid, it sticks in our mind, and we think that it represents all young people, when in actual fact it might not. So when you add into this the whole idea that you get in the media of if it bleeds, it leads, you have a problem. So the media is attracted to rare, strange, sensational, unusual cases, which they then report. We then take this in, and then the availability bias makes us believe that this very rare instance is the opposite of what it really is. They make us think that a rare instance is actually common, but it's not. And statistics can help us guard against this, as against all of the other biases that I've mentioned. And finally, of course, there's selection bias. So if you are, for example, somebody in the United States who's in favor of Mitt Romney, who's a staunch Republican, the chances are that a lot of your social circle are also going to be staunch Republicans. You could substitute any other kind of political point of view. People in favor of Scottish independence will know other people who are in favor of Scottish independence. So the group of people you're meeting, even if it's a large number, are not selected in a scientific manner, and so they're also unrepresentative and give you a faulty idea of what the whole population is thinking. Okay? And again, statistics, providing it's done properly, providing that the sample from which you're making inferences is drawn in a proper manner from the population, statistics mitigates against that kind of bias. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of a sort of geeky introduction to my techniques, or to the techniques which many of us use, or the techniques I've been using. Now I'm going to apply them to some of these questions that are facing Australian policymakers. So the first thing is casualty sensitivity. What my colleague John Blackstone calls the casualty cringe is seen as being a major constraint on Australian policymakers. That is, Australians are thought to find it very, very, very difficult to take casualties. And this has certainly shaped the operational deployment of the Australian Defence Force in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They've been deployed in such a way as to minimise the chances that Australians are going to come home in body bags. And in some cases, many Australian commanders believe that this is a major constraint on their ability to actually achieve their goals. Also, incidentally, in future conflicts, may conflict with some of the moral imperatives to minimise civilian casualties on the other side, especially if it leads to an excessive reliance on things like aerial bombing, which protect your own personnel but put enemy civilians at risk. Some analysts, such as James Brown of the Lowy Institute, believe that this is an especially big problem for Australia, even relative to other countries like the United States, Britain and Canada. He traces this back to Australia's experience in Gallipoli and the myth that grew out of it of Australian soldiers being sacrificed for goals that were not in the national interest of Australia. So there's a few problems with studying casualty sensitivity. First of these is that there aren't terribly many polls that are taken on subjects like the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. So, and even in countries like the United States, for example, where they have very regular polling, there's only maybe about 30 or so. And polls by their nature, one or two of them can show very, very widely varying results, even if they're collected in the same way. So there's a problem that you can read far too much into one or two small polls about the relationship between casualties and support by a given war, and I believe that that's why James Brown erroneously came to the conclusion that he did. Second, there's no real outcome to compare the polls to. So in the case of predicting how much percentage of the vote a party is going to get in an election, you can actually have the election to check how well the pollster did at estimating that party's vote share. You can't really do that in the case of casualty sensitivity. But most importantly, in the real world, there are lots of other things that are going on at exactly the same time as casualties. So to give you an example, suppose the Taliban announce their brand new spring offensive in a given year. There are Australian troops on the ground, and the Taliban mount a bunch of attacks, and a number of Australians are killed. So at the same time, you have information coming at voters that the war is not going well, that the Taliban are still strong, but at the same time Australians are dying. So if the poll numbers in support of the war in Afghanistan come down, it's not entirely clear whether it's because of the casualties or whether it's because of the information the voters are getting about how well the war is going. So the solution which was hit upon to this by my advisors at Duke University with respect to the United States is something called a survey experiment. And this is something that the Obama campaign made an awful lot of use of in terms of how they crafted their messaging and so on. So the idea is that you take a sample as closely as possible, randomly selected from the population, and then you divide it again at random to receive different pieces of information about a given situation. And then you compare what the results are in terms of opinion between the different treatments that are randomly assigned. Because there's a reasonably large number of people in each of the samples, and because the samples are assigned at random, you can be sure that it's the differences in the information that they're receiving and not something else that's actually driving the results. Okay? So my advisors, Chris Jelpy, Peter Fever, and their former graduate student, Jason Reifler, did this in the United States and found that, in fact, information about how well the war is progressing on the ground is actually much more important than casualties in terms of driving US public support for the war. So I replicated this as far as possible in an Australian context, and I can talk more about this later if you guys are interested, with an online survey experiment. It was done through Research Now's online panel, and they were randomly assigned to one of three scenarios. Well, in actual fact, there was 3x3 scenarios. Casualties ranged from 5, which is the lowest level of casualties, to 500 for the Australian Defence Force. That's basically rescaling the original American numbers weighted for Australia's population, with the prospects of success ranging from not very high to very high, as in the American study. And the results are, prospects for success matter more than casualties for Australians, and in fact, this result is much more consistent in the Australian sample than it is in the American one. So here's a little bit of the numbers here. So in each of these conditions, up here we have the Australian study. The Chief of Defence Force was stated to be very confident of success. Then you had high casualties, medium casualties, low casualties. Okay, you notice that the Chief of the Defence Force being not very confident of success versus very confident of success increases, or rather decreases support for the war by 9%, whereas moving from the lowest level of casualties to the highest level of casualties decreases support by only 7%. So it's a smaller effect. In the US equivalent, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff were giving the same information to American voters, the difference, it actually made more of a difference for casualties at lower levels than at higher levels. And so it wasn't consistently the case that casualties mattered less than information across all of the different conditions. And again, I can go into this a little bit further later on in the question and answer session. Now, another interesting thing, just by the by, is the fact that the Australians don't seem, under any of the conditions, to be particularly in favour of foreign interventions, no matter what the casualties or prospects of success are. Again, that's something I can go to just a little bit later. Okay, so now I come to the ANZUS Alliance. Now, there's a number of polls that have been showing for a while now, whether it be the AES or LOE. Older people tend to be more in favour of the ANZUS Alliance than younger people. Now, the question that arises from this, does this mean that Australia and the United States will drift apart as the older generation die off? Now, this gets to what is known in the literature as an age period cohort question. I'll tell you a little bit about what this means. Age. It's quite simply this. Older people are more attached to the status quo for whatever reason. Older people in Britain tend to vote for the Tories, older people in the United States tend to vote for the Republicans, older people here tend to vote for the Liberals. Period. Period are things which happen in a given year or time period. So, for example, in the last Australian federal election, the Labour Party created what some people called a circular firing squad, which was something which may well have lowered the Labour Party's level of support at that point in time, but may not actually have anything to do with longer underlying structural factors. Other things that can constitute period effects include economic downturns, wars, etc. And a cohort, this means it's quite subtle. It's kind of a mixture of the two. Cohort effects are when events which happen during your formative political years continue to affect your views for the rest of your life. And it's distinct from age. And I'll give you a little example here to make clear the distinction between an age effect and a cohort effect. So as I said earlier, older Americans are generally more likely to vote Republican. Back in the 1990s, the very oldest voters tended to vote Democrat. I remember in my own personal experience, I met some old farmer type from rural Indiana and had a bit of a conversation with him about politics. And of course I expected, given where he came from and given his age, he'd be a die-hard Fox News watching Bush-loving Republican. But it turned out that he couldn't stand Bush. He was a staunch Democrat, and he spent most of his time talking to me about how things were so much better off under Clinton or Kennedy or even Jimmy Carter. So why is this? Why is it that generally older Americans, up until quite recently, tended to be Republicans, while the very oldest Americans tended to be Democrats? Well, it's because they grew up with this guy, FDR. They grew up at a time in which a Republican president, Herbert Hoover, had apparently bungled the Great Depression. And then Roosevelt came in, and with his New Deal, was perceived to have turned the American economy around. Made him terribly popular. He won re-election more times than any other American president since. He won the Second World War. And the individuals who came of age politically when Roosevelt was president remained more likely to be Democrats than the rest of the American population for the rest of their lives. And it's only now that that generation are dying off that older Americans tend to be Republicans. But I digress. So, coming back to the question of ANZUS, why do these distinctions matter? Well, if it's age, if it's age just by itself, then as the older generation were more pro-American die off, then America and Australia will genuinely begin to drift apart. America and Australia will not drift apart because the older pro-American generation will be replaced by the next generation getting more pro-American as they age too and also become more attached to the status quo. If it's a cohort effect, then as the World War II generation die off, they will not be replaced and pro-ANZUS sentiment will decline, unless of course a new generation has a very positive experience of the United States, in which case that'll have its effect further down the road. Moreover, there could be generational replacement, whereas Australia becomes more multicultural and better educated, it also becomes less pro-American. Now, this should give you just a little bit of arithmetic, should give us a certain reason to doubt the idea of the cohort effect and the World War II generation dying off and this leading to Australia and the US drifting apart. Because if you think about it, an individual who was 20 in 1944 would now be 19 years old. So a large proportion of the World War II generation has already died off. And yet still older people tend to be overwhelmingly pro-American. So this suggests to me, at least from the beginning, that in actual fact it's age and not the specific generational experience of World War II that is actually driving pro-American sentiment. So there is a slight problem in analysing all of these different factors, period effects, age effects, and cohort effects, and that is that they are all what statisticians call collinear. So what that means is, if you know that I was born in 1980, and you know that I'm 34 years old, then you know that the year in which I'm being asked to give the question is 2014, and vice versa. So it's not possible to determine whether I believe what I believe because I'm 34, because I was born in 1980, or because it's 2014. So there's no really easy solution to this problem. But what I did was, I pulled together all of the Australian election studies from 1993 to 2013 to give an idea of how certain generations change in their opinions over time. And then I looked at two particular generations who had a formative experience of the United States that you would think would be so strong as to stay with them over the course of their political lives. At the same time, I controlled for a number of other factors, including age, higher education, and ethnicity, to see what the possible future scenarios could be for American-Australian relations. And here's what I found. Cohort, however I'm defining it, and if people are interested in the definition, they can ask about it in the Q&A, has no significant impact on one's view of the alliance separate from age. As individuals get older, they become more pro-American regardless of whether their formative political experience was World War II which one would think would make a positive impression of the United States, or Vietnam, which one would think would make a negative impression of the United States. To illustrate this, I'm showing a little bit of a table of the predicted probabilities of holding a given opinion of the ANZUS Treaty by age. So for a 21-year-old, you see, the probability of thinking ANZUS is very important is 39%. For a 60-year-old, it's 51%. For a 40-year-old, it's 45%. But still, I mean, the differences amongst the ages are not actually that big, because most Australians believe the ANZUS alliance is either important or very important. So if you sum the people who think very or fairly important together, there's very little difference between 21-year-olds and 60-year-olds. But there is definitely a difference. It's just not that big. The impact of Vietnam, by contrast, actually changes over time as individuals get older. So here what I have is the predicted probability of a respondent saying that the ANZUS alliance is very important, with the thick line representing the Vietnam generation and the dashed line representing the non-Vietnam generation. The probabilities are on the y-axis there, and the AIS study year is traced here, going from 1993 up to 2007. So if we see in 1993, when the Vietnam generation were younger, they were actually less likely to believe that the alliance was very important than other members of the population, people who were not part of the Vietnam generation. In 1996, the same was true. However, by 1998, a shift had occurred. They're very, very close as they were in 1996, but in this case, the Vietnam generation were slightly more likely to say it was more important. 2001, the same was true. 2004, the gap gets bigger. 2007, the gap is even bigger. So what's happening? The Vietnam generation are getting older. They're getting up into pensionable age, whereas the non-Vietnam generation, the people who are older than them, are older than the Vietnam generation, are dying off, and new people are coming into the cycle who are younger. So essentially, age is winning out over formative experience in this particular case. Additionally, Australians whose heritage is not English speaking are less likely than the average to support ANZUS, but they are still more likely to support it than not. Remember what I said earlier, the vast majority of Australians believe that the ANZUS Treaty is either very or somewhat important to Australia's security. And this includes Australians whose background is not from the English speaking world. It's just that they are slightly less likely to think so than Australians who are of an Anglo-Celtic heritage. The same is also true for Australians with a tertiary education or more. So the effects of higher education are just the way people might imagine that they are. Australians who've been to university are slightly less willing to view ANZUS as being important or very important to Australia's security than individuals who do not have a tertiary education. But again, the differences are pretty small. So this suggests that if the Australian population does become slightly better educated and slightly more multicultural, by which I mean slightly less Anglo-Celtic, then it may become slightly less pro-American. But when I say slightly less, I mean very slightly less. The effects of higher education are shown here. For degree holders, the percentage believing it to be the probability of believing it to be very important are 40%. For non-degree holders, it's 54%. So that's quite a big difference at the very highest level of importance. However, if you sum very important and fairly important, it's 85% for degree holders and 90% for non-degree holders. It's still a noticeable difference, but by my reckoning, 85% is still pretty much a landslide. So those of us that are around here from the United States need not fear that increasing higher education in Australia is going to have much of a detrimental effect on support for the ANZUS Treaty. Similarly, support for the ANZUS Treaty at the very highest levels is lower amongst those from a non-Anglo-Celtic heritage, 41%, than it is from those from an Anglo-Celtic heritage at 48%. However, again, if you sum the very or fairly important totals, you end up with something that is almost indistinguishable. So really there isn't that much of a difference. Now the question is, okay, what happens to non-Anglo-Celtic Australians and what happens to degree holders as they get older? So it could very well be that age actually wipes out these small differences. So what I did was I had a look at interacting ethnicity and age and seeing how individuals' opinions towards ANZUS change as they get older, depending on whether they are Anglo or non-Anglo, or a degree holder or not a degree holder. So here we have the effects of ethnicity by age, graphing it at 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60. The Anglos are the thick line, and the dashed line are non-Anglos. So we see here that both groups increase their level of support for ANZUS as they get older. However, there's no convergence between the two. They go in parallel. Both Anglos and non-Anglos become more supportive of ANZUS as they get older, but the gap between them remains, which again suggests that if Australia were to become slightly more ethnic over the course of the next few decades, then it's likely to become a tiny bit less pro-American, but not really that much. You observe a similar dynamic with respect to higher education. So here we have non-degree holders, the solid line, and degree holders, the dashed line. Now it's slightly different to ethnicity in that actually they start to diverge. So degree holders become more likely as they age to believe that ANZUS is very important, but the effect is not as sharp as with non-degree holders. So they actually diverge from each other as they get older. But again, for anyone who's concerned about ANZUS, the effect is not huge, and older degree holders are still overwhelmingly likely to believe that ANZUS is in some way important, whether that be fairly or very. So now getting to the final issue that I'm going to talk about this evening. China. Here we see a nice aerial shot of the Sino-Iron project, co-production of Chinese companies and the delightful Mr. Clive Palmer MP. Should actually, interestingly, given some of the rather colourful views that Mr. Palmer has expressed, it should actually give you a little bit of a heads up of the kind of findings that I'm going to give you just in a second. He's an individual who makes millions, he's made a fortune from trading with China. And yet, as we can see, it hasn't stopped him expressing some really pretty controversial and pretty upsetting reviews about that country. And in actual fact, he is genuinely representative, I think, of a broader pattern within Australian society. So the question of how to deal with the rise in China is one of the key issues that Australia is going to have to deal with in the coming century. Obviously, my colleague Hugh White has written about the China choice, in which he suggests a policy of moving slightly closer to Beijing and slightly further away from Washington. So what might shape individuals, Australians' view of whether China is a security threat or not? Now, the Australian Electoral Survey asks the question of, for a number of countries, whether they view them as being a military threat. It's actually a unique and very valuable source in that sense in Asia Pacific. Not very many other extensive national polls ask that same subject. So it's a really good way in the sense of tapping into what drives Australian sentiment towards the Chinese. So there's two things that could be important thinking about it. The first thing is their economic interests. So Australia is very highly dependent on trade with China. It's a very open economy, and China is by far and away Australia's largest trading partner. By contrast, the United States is much less open, and in actual fact, Canada is its number one trading partner, China only being number 3. So Australians have a large economic interest in having good relations with the Chinese, so as to keep up the trade which is going on between the two countries that's benefiting ordinarily Australians. You might believe that individuals who have a particular stake in trade with China, and in this case that would be individuals whose livelihood depends on exporting to China, overwhelmingly miners and agricultural workers, or people whose livelihoods are dependent on those sectors, would be most likely to view China in a positive light. And that's the interpretation that the Lowy Institute took in the 2013 Australia and the World Poll, when they noted that views of China as a security threat are much less likely to be held in Western Australia, which is more highly dependent on trade with China, than in other states which are less dependent on trade with the Chinese. So this appears to make sense. Alternatively, there's an issue that political scientists call outgroup anxiety. And that's a way of basically saying an individual's sense of unease, a dislike of spending time or confronting individuals who are culturally, ethnically, racially, religiously different to oneself. One might choose to call that in some ways racism, but I couldn't possibly comment. So in the Australian case, it's clear who has the most to gain and the most to lose from trade with China. Top 20 exports to China are all agricultural or mining products. Top 20 imports are all manufacturing products. However, as China is ethnically and culturally distinct from Australia's population, which, in spite of Australia's increasing multiculturalism, is still overwhelmingly of European descent, China's rise may tap into racialized anxieties. So, racialized anxieties are an individual characteristic, but economic interests, in many ways, are characteristic of areas of the country, as the Lowy Institute were saying. So, if you live in an area that's heavily dependent on mining or agriculture or manufacture, no matter what your job is, it could very well be that your opinions are going to be more pro-Chinese than the average person somewhere else. So what you have is you have group level or geographical unit level characteristics and individual characteristics, and you're trying to figure out the effects of them at the same time. Now the standard way of doing this in political science is the hierarchical model. It's the idea that individuals' views are shaped by individual characteristics like prejudice, but also characteristics of groups that they belong to or locations in which they live, such as states or electoral districts or cities or municipalities. A really good example of this is a book by a guy called Andrew Gelman at Columbia University, who wrote Rich State, Poor State, Red State, Blue State. He looked at the paradox of why it is that although the Democrats advocate policies that would appear to benefit the working man, poor people, it seems to be that their support is in richer states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans advocate policies that seem to benefit wealthier people, but their support is in places like Arkansas, Tennessee, etc. And what he did was, using a hierarchical model, he found that the wealthier one's state is, the more likely you are to vote for the Democrats, but the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. So this sheds light on something that was otherwise really quite puzzling to an awful lot of political scientists. So this is the kind of model that I'm going to be using and applying it to the question of Australian opinion towards China. So what I wanted to do, first of all, was to get some idea of the geographical basis of Australian economic interests in good relations with the Chinese. This is from Geosciences Australia, and each one of these little green dots represents a working mine of one of the minerals that Australia exports to China. The graphic is taken from Google Maps. I then tied this up with data from the 2011 census, which gives electoral district level information on where all of the population live and work. And so I looked at the proportion of people in the labour force employed in either mining or agriculture by district, and then mapped onto Australian divisions. And this really, for anybody who is Australian or knows a lot about Australia, this really maps onto what you would commonsensically think of Australia as being like. WA is highly dominated by mining, represented by that deep shade of purple, all the way up to the northern parts of southern Australia, rural Queensland, with these little tiny areas down around the city here, represented in very, very light purple, having very little or no connection to mining or agriculture because they're predominantly urban. So in this study, again I was using the Australian electoral study, this time 2013, along with the 2011 census and Geosciences Australia, Australians Mine Atlas, trying to figure out what it is that makes Australians more or less likely to be hostile or scared of China. To get the idea of outgroup anxiety or racial prejudice, I used a technique called factor analysis to take Australians' answers to a number of questions that dig into racial anxieties, such as, for example, are white Australians still advantaged when it comes to getting jobs? Has the government gone too far in terms of making concessions to Aborigines? Do ethnic Australians think of themselves too much as being members of ethnic groups and not as being members of Australia? Combine all of this into a single measure of what I called outgroup anxiety, and then compared the effects of this to the effects of being economically or living in an area that's economically dependent on trade with China. So what did I find? So here's where I'm starting to bring in some of the graphics. So this is a simulation, a prediction derived from my statistical model about the effects of these different variables. Okay, this right here in the middle is, if you like, the control group, or the kind of the average person. This is what the average person is thinking about China as a security threat, round about the middle of the distribution. Okay, this is the average Australian's opinion. So now the dashed line, this is a simulation of what would happen if you took that individual and then put them into the constituency or district within Australia that is the most dependent upon trade with China. Okay, so it shifts their perception of viewing China as a security threat a tiny amount downwards, but the two distributions overlap, which means that it's kind of hard to distinguish this from pure chance. On the other hand, outgroup anxiety, that is the anxiety about hanging out with members of other racial groups, raise this to its maximum value, and you actually shift things really far up. So you shift it from about a 50% chance of believing that China is a security threat up to around about an 80% chance on average. So in other words, what the rise of China militarily is doing with Australian voters, I believe, is it's tapping into a lot of different racial anxieties about Australia's survival as an outpost of European, white, Western culture in the Asia Pacific. That's really what's driving. Economic interests aren't really that important and aren't counteracting this effect to anything like the degree that they would need to do in order to negate it. And Clive Palmer's a very good example of this. I mean, he expresses those kind of things that makes tons and tons of money out of trading with the Chinese. So, one of the important things to note in these kind of studies is that even assuming that you've run a really good statistical model and you've done everything correctly, still 5 times out of every 100, significant results that you're going to get, results that will get you published, will actually not be reflective of reality. That is, you're thinking that there's really a relationship between two variables, but in actual fact there aren't. You just happen to get a lucky sample in which that relationship is found. So one of the ways to test against this is to divide up your data set and pretend that, say, 25% or 50% of it is something that you had no access to when you were originally running your regression, and then use the effects that you estimated from the bit that you kept to predict what would have happened as if this was entirely new information. Okay? If it predicts well, then it shows that this variable really genuinely is important. It's capturing something real in the world, and it wasn't just that you lucked out and happened to get it significant just by chance. So I did this with both of the export dependence and the outgroup anxiety measure. So if you try and use export dependence to predict individuals' views on China's security threat outside of the original data, then you do absolutely no better than you would if you just simply tossed a coin and guessed 50-50. Okay? So that really does suggest that export dependence has very little effect in this case. If you were to use outgroup anxiety, on the other hand, you'd actually do slightly better, as this demonstration shows. Okay? Now, this is a receiver operating characteristic curve. It's pretty technical. I won't go into it in great depth unless anyone wants to know about it in the Q&A. But what you want to imagine intuitively is that this line going from the bottom left to the top right represents a prediction from a 50-50 guess, right? So tossing a coin and say if it lands heads, I'll say this person's scared of China. If it lands tails, this person isn't. And anything below this, okay, if the variable, if the model is below this, then basically it's saying that this model is doing worse than a 50-50 guess. This model is worse than useless, essentially. On the other hand, anything that is to the northwest of this line is the improvement that you get in terms of predicting an individual's views and by using this model rather than simply relying on a guess. So as you can see, outgroup anxiety does improve somewhat our ability to predict an individual's views of China as a security threat. And that area between the thick, dark curve and the dashed line going from top left to bottom right, that is how much it improves it by. Okay, so if you know how an individual feels about Aboriginal land rights, whether people should identify as Australians or members of ethnic groups, etc., you can predict with some degree of accuracy what they're going to think about China as a military threat. So, outgroup anxiety is a much more important influence on whether Australians perceive China to be a security threat than economic interests. However, given the fact that there's all of this, if we go back here, all of this area here is what the outgroup anxiety variable is failing to predict. So that's all of the other things, essentially, you might want to say, that make people view China one way or another that have nothing to do with outgroup anxiety. So outgroup anxiety doesn't do a fantastic job either of predicting how people are going to view China. So it suggests to me that people don't see the idea of China as being a military threat as being a particularly salient issue. It's not an issue people think hard about. It's not an issue people really care that much about as yet. And I think this is also shown by the fact that the perception of China as a security threat seems to fluctuate quite a lot over years in the AES and also the Lowy poll as well. So I think that really China's image in the minds of the Australian population isn't really fully set in stone as yet. One is a little bit anxious about the end of Australia as a European cultural area, if you like, then one is somewhat more likely to view China as a military threat. But even those type of people don't really think about it or care about it that much. That would be my interpretation of this. So, coming to the end now, the bottom line. What is it that policymakers, citizens, the media should be taking away from these findings? Well, first of all, like Americans, Australians care more about the prospects for success of a mission than they do about the casualties. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that an Australian government can just send Australian troops in to be slaughtered and just get the Chief of the Defence Force up there to say, yes, we have a fantastic plan for winning this war and I fully believe in it, because not only would that be immoral, but it also would then cease to be effective over time, because the Chief of the Defence Force is trusted at present in Australia, I believe, precisely because it's thought that he's not subject to political manipulation. The takeaway from this is not that Australian policymakers should bang on and on and on about victory and say that they're really, really confident of victory even when they're not, or make up a bunch of bogus metrics that they can use to claim that mission has been accomplished or is being accomplished. The takeaway from this is that if Australian policymakers believe it is in their national interest to send Australian troops into battle, then they should have a really, really clear plan for how they're going to win it, and they should clearly communicate this to the Australian public. They should not, however, be worried that an excessive amount of casualty phobia is going to prevent the Australian Defence Force from adopting the tactics that it needs to adopt in order to get the job done. That was not the case for the United States, that's not the case for Australia either. And there's no evidence of James Brown's concept of Anzacs long shadow. There's no evidence from my study and also from my analysis of Australian polling in Afghanistan that there is any idea of Australians being more sensitive to casualties than Americans, Brits, Canadians, whoever really. In fact, they're quite a lot less sensitive to casualties, I would say, than, for example, the Germans or other continental Europeans. Bottom line answers. Now, it is said that one of the easiest ways to make yourself look foolish is to make a prediction about the future, and it's absolutely true. But I also happen to believe that social scientists should make predictions about the future, precisely because if I make a prediction and it gets and it turns out to be right, then I've performed a service. But I've also performed a service if I make a prediction and it turns out to be wrong, because that shows that something is wrong with my understanding, and I can then go back and check it. Whereas if I'm camouflaging things, then I never get to find out. Then bad ideas that I have never get sort of rooted out and corrected. So I am going to make a prediction on this one. Australian support for the ANZUS alliance is solid. Support for the alliance will not drop as the World War II generation dies off, or any other generation at present. The generations below them will, like generations before them, become more pro-American naturally, as my boss Brendan and my other colleague Peter Dean suggested that they would in an ASPE strategist post some time ago. They will become more pro-American over time. In actual fact, if the age structure of the Australian population changes such that older people are a larger proportion of the population, and this is happening in all the wealthy countries, then in fact the implication of this is that Australia will become more pro-American, not less pro-American. Now, increasing non-Anglo immigration and the expansion of higher education might reduce support for ANZUS somewhat. There is support for that view in the data that I've looked at, but it would still, even under those conditions, enjoy the support of a comfortable majority of Australians. And of course, given current policies towards higher education, HECS, on the one hand, and towards the boats on the other, the idea that Australia is going to become more educated, more multicultural in the future is certainly not a done deal. So even if it did, however, support for ANZUS would remain solid. Now, I haven't talked about the black swan events that Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about. It is possible, of course, that there is some really unforeseen event that could throw a spanner in the works of this confident prediction. It could be that the United States will elect some very, very belligerent president who drags Australia into a ruinous war with China, in which case it's quite possible that support for ANZUS will drop across the whole way. However, I mean, we've seen some pretty big events over the course of the last 20 plus years, and they have, in some cases, caused support for ANZUS to rise and fall. 9/11 caused it to rise, the Iraq War caused it to fall, but it still retained the support of an overwhelming majority of Australians. So what I would say is that such a black swan event would have to be really, really big and have a really, really negative effect on Australians' view of the United States in order for Australians to turn again, for a majority of Australians to turn against the alliance. So bottom line, China. Economic interests aren't pushing individual Australians in a more pro-Chinese direction. If several $1 million worth of trade is not doing it for Clive Palmer, then tens of thousands of dollars are not going to do it for your average Joe Miner, assuming the average Joe Miner even knows that the stuff he's digging out of the ground is actually being sold to the Chinese. So in this sense, the hope of many great liberals throughout history that economic interdependence will foster amity amongst nations, it at least doesn't really seem to be working in the case of Australia and China. Fear of China as a security threat has a distinct ethnic and cultural tinge. It does really kind of get into the idea at the turn of the century, the whole yellow peril concept. However, this shouldn't be overplayed. I don't think that the idea of China as a security threat is especially salient as yet for Australians. So I mean, if I were to give advice on Xi Jinping and how to woo Australians over, I would say that your image in this country has not really been fully formed as yet. You've got a lot of latitude for your actions to reassure Australians. And even the racial distinction is not necessarily going to be something that will always be a problem for Australians. I mean, perceptions of Japan as a security threat, for example, over decades have dwindled to almost nothing. So if China continues to reassure Australians in the way that Premier Xi did in his recent speech to Canberra, and if he shows in its actions that it is intent on a peaceful rise, then there is no reason why in decades these kind of anxieties will not be allayed. So that's the positive scenario, and that's what I would take away from that if I were Chinese leaders. In future, however, if the United States and China were to engage in intensified security competition, the unfortunate implication of what I'm saying is that opinion on the China choice may break down along ethnic lines and also along political lines. So on the one hand, you would have the more the Australians of non-Anglo heritage, Australians of more left-wing political persuasions, especially in the big cities, who would be more in favour of taking a pro-Chinese or neutral line, and Anglo-Australians, rural Australians, conservative Australians be more in favour of sticking very, very closely to Washington and not giving any concessions to the Chinese. That's, again, however, that's only a possible scenario. It's not destiny and it's not set in stone. As we've seen from this, I mean, the effects of many of these variables are not exceptionally strong, and there are an awful lot of ifs and buts involved in this analysis. And I don't want to end on too harsh a note. I think that the prospects for improving relations between Australia and China are actually pretty strong, especially if China continues to move in this in terms of rising peace. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to this talk this evening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, was Democratic territory,
Yeah.
and now it's become Republican territory. And even though there's been a change to some extent in the socioeconomic balance of the states, they're still amongst the poorest and dumbest in America. So, what, if that's not, if economics isn't the factor there, what's going to explain that quite decisive flip?
Right. Well, I agree. In fact, if you look at the electoral map of the United States, the Electoral College map in 1898, it's almost the exact opposite of the American Electoral College map in 2000. So all of the states that were Democratic in 2000 were Republican in 1898. And I think in many ways it's because although the two parties have actually kept the same labels, they've actually, in essence, switched sides with each other in terms of a lot of their ideology and position. So it used to be the case that the Republicans appealed to African Americans, they were in favor of civil rights, they were quite socially liberal in most things, whereas the Democrats, although they had that northeastern wing, they were primarily a party that appealed to large numbers of southern segregationists and so on. So they have switched sides, and partly it is because of the fact that the Republicans and Democrats are almost diametrically opposite today to what stand for almost diametrically opposite things today to what they did 100 or so years ago. However, I do agree. I think that there are lots of factors going on besides economic ones. And Gelman in his book talks about the importance of religion and religious attendance. So as state income goes down, or rather in states in which the income is already low, religious attendance tends to be higher, which means that people are more likely to vote for Republicans, and Republicans are perceived as being more religious. And so what happens there is that your position in the income distribution within your state has to be much lower in Republican type states like Kansas in order for you to vote Democrat than it does in Democratic states like Connecticut or Massachusetts or New York. Essentially, that's how you resolve the paradox of poor states being pro-Republican but poor people being pro-Democrats. The poorest people in each state always tend to be Democrats, while the poorest states tend to be Republican, because the average income at which one switches from Democrat to Republican is lower in the poorer states.
Might take the chair's prerogative to ask a short question.
Yeah.
Compared to, you talked a little bit about the US, Barack Obama's campaign kind of drawing in a lot of these methods and kind of talking about it. There's obviously a very vibrant academic discussion in the US around these kinds of methods. How do you find the Australian government's kind of understanding of the attitudes of the public? Are they very aligned with this? Do you think they tend to pay much attention to public opinion?
It's an interesting question. I haven't done an awful lot of work with the Australian government on public opinion. I think Professor McAllister is much more the person to talk to about this. Yes and no would be the answer. I think the Australian election study is a fantastic resource, and there's troves and troves and troves of data out there for analysts to look at. But at the same time, in terms of their support for graduate training and so forth, the Australian government isn't really giving people the tools to analyse this data in a really convincing way, because you're sort of limiting the training that people give down to 3 years, which makes it really, really difficult for you to actually acquire all of the tools. Like I said, the first 2 years that I spent in the United States were intensive, sort of training and analysing this kind of thing. Whereas in Australia, because you only have funding for 3 years from the government, it doesn't really allow you to do that. Now, in terms of actually taking things on board and using these kind of techniques, I was talking to a guy called Peter John just a year ago, who is the expert in what's called field experiments. So he does these kind of experiments where he randomly sends people to get this and that, and then see how likely they are to vote, and various other things. Assigning certain people to get one type of training and certain people to get another type of training, see how likely they are to find a job. He's already been pioneering a lot of this work within the British government, and one of the first things that Abbott did when he came into power was to get Peter John to come over and to talk to him and to pioneer some of these things within the Australian government. So I think that the Australian government is actually taking a lot of this on board now, and I think it will be to the good. And obviously, we're working together just now on doing something along these lines within the Australian army. So I think that there's an awful lot of openness to things, you know? And things like experiments, for example, they're very, they're actually really quite intuitive. They don't require, you know, super complex, fancy models in many ways. As long as the research design is good, then they can be implemented and understood quite well by lay people, non-technical specialists, essentially. Oh, yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on whether there's any data available on what things Australians do find safe in terms of their ability of someone to influence their vote. And also from that, you may not have, you know, I'm assuming you haven't specifically looked at this, but whether there's any relationship between how Australians are dependent on China and whether that is a salient factor in their voting.
Okay. Yeah, so on the first question, yeah, the AES has got questions on what you think should be the first priority, second priority for the government in the next few years. So yeah, there's definitely data on those kind of things. And also, Keith Dowdy and Aaron Martin published an article about how salient various issues are publicly, how much Parliament responds to those. So there's lots of things that have been done on that. And in terms of interests in trade with China, so your actual interest in terms of trade with a given country is really quite difficult to measure. The best way of doing it would be to simply say, okay, what company do you work for, and then look at that company, see where they export and everything, but actually doing that would be prohibitively time consuming and therefore prohibitively expensive. So as a next best solution, a lot of analysts have looked at things like the AES or the World Value Survey and looked at what people's occupations are. And so they said, okay, if you're an electrician or something like that, you might be dependent on exports because you work in creative this or that. The problem with that being that there's lots and lots of occupations that don't really match on any one specific industry or sector. It's difficult to see where they fall in. So my approach is essentially a new extension of this type of literature where I'm looking at geography as being what determines your economic activities. You know, if you think about it, even if you're working in something like, I don't know, a real estate agency in an area that's very highly dominated by mining, the chances are that you are probably quite dominated by mining as well, even if you don't directly work in it. Because it's your local area, it's your patch, you know it. You couldn't easily just pop off to Melbourne and start doing the same work there, essentially. So I think that the measure that I've advanced of economic interest in trade with China is not perfect for sure, but I think it's the best one that's really available.
Compulsory voting versus voluntary voting. Can that have an impact on those numbers? But you're only looking at the people who voted. In Australia, that's everybody. In America, it was what, 34% last time?
Yeah, that's right.
No, 34% did count 42%.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, no, it's very, very good.
So who doesn't vote? Republicans? Poor people? Rich people?
Poor people, yeah. Yeah. Poor people and young people tend to vote. Yeah. So,
People, what are they? Are they closet people? Sort of closet Democrats?
most people would say they're probably closet Democrats for the simple fact that they're poor. So one of the reasons why people say Barack Obama won in 2008 and 2012 is because they got a bunch of people who are Democrat, who are naturally Democrats but don't usually vote, and actually got them to vote. So African Americans, Hispanics, poor people, young people, etc. It's an interesting question, but if you look at, say, for instance, the casualty sensitivity thing, so in the US studies, I believe that they did not actually weight their polls by whether someone was likely to vote or not. So therefore, what they're doing is just coming up with a random sample of the population, irrespective of whether they're likely to vote. So I don't see it to make a huge difference in that instance. That's true. The Australian survey was an online one, which makes it slightly different from the American one. It's an online survey, although these research companies try and make it nationally representative, it's still likely to be somewhat different because of the fact that you have to actually opt into an online survey rather than just getting a phone call or a door knock from somebody. So it's likely to attract people more politically interested and politically engaged. That is one important difference to the American survey. I can't see how that would change the results. And in another way, essentially, perhaps it's people who are more politically engaged and interested that you really want to find out about anyway, because they're the people who will convince others. They are the people who will run protests, Sure, they're not allowed to vote in Australia because everyone has to vote, but they're possibly more allowed to influence other countries. So that's the response.
There was one at the back. No.
Thanks, Charlie. It was really interesting. I was just interested in your, I think it was particularly your graph about attitudes towards answers. And I was interested that you described that in terms of the Australian public being pro-American at the same time being pro-alliance. I was just wondering, I wonder if I could talk about a little bit more on that, that distinction. I mean, is it an important distinction? It's hard to conceive what that would be now, but if in the future there was to be another great and powerful friend or a collection of great and powerful friends, some kind of global alternative to the American alliance, do you predict that would have any impact on Australian views of the alliance, or is it something more, I suppose, more of a kind of soft power explanation? Is there something inherently attractive about America because it is America that explains the kind of continuum or is that distinction is not really
Yes, it's an interesting question. So, yeah, in theory, logically, one could be anti-American and still in favor of the alliance. And I remember, I've met individual people who said, I don't really like the Americans that much, but yeah, we do need them for our security. And I'm quite happy to exploit the hell out of them for that purpose. Sorry, I kind of from yeah. But, yeah, I mean, in spite of the fact that they're logically separable, in practice they're not separate. So, for example, the Living student, I believe it tends to be yes, have also asked, not just are you in favour of the alliance, but how warm do you feel towards the United States? How much do you like Americans? And the two things correlate very, very, very highly. So yeah, there are a few people who might like Americans but not support the alliance, or like the alliance but not support the Americans. But in general, the two things are pretty close to one another. I'm quite sure if you'd done this, 100 years ago, then you would have probably found similar numbers for the alliance with Britain. And if in 100 years' time, say, China were democratized and were Australia's great and powerful friend, if Australia's ethnic cultural makeup were the same then as it is now, then it probably wouldn't be quite as warm towards China as it currently is towards the United States, I'm afraid to say. But at the same time, I think that if China's behaviour were similar to that of the United States over the next 100 years, and China were the most powerful country in the world, I think the majority of Australians would switch to seeing China in that light, albeit the relations wouldn't be as warm because of the cultural difference. They wouldn't be as warm as they are with the United States.
The results on casualty sensitivity I thought were very interesting. You've probably gone about as far as anybody can go on that, using quantitative data that was short, perhaps killing someone, asking everybody what they thought about it. But I wonder, you focus on success, you say that's the nature of the variable. I actually wonder if it's time and elapsed time. What we know from the polls is that when conflict starts, and there's a value around the flag effect, and then as time goes on, and the conflict isn't resolved, then that public support tends to slip away. So I wonder if the crucial variable there is time rather than actually success itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have enough difficulty getting the ethics committee to agree to an online survey, so killing somebody probably is not something. It would certainly take them a while anyway to prove it. But it's quite possible that it is simply time. However, when you think about it, time is likely in itself to provide information about the course of the war. So, I mean, if you haven't won it after 8 years, then that probably provides a certain amount of information that you're probably not going to win. So, time and prospects for success are not, in that sense, too independent. However, I mean, if you look at the course of the war in Afghanistan, there was a big gap between the start of the war, between the initial successful kind of honeymoon period, if you like, of the war, when the Taliban were top, and it seemed like everything had all been sorted out back in 2002, 2003, and then it just dropped off the radar and was replaced with Iraq until about 2006, when the Taliban really started to make their comeback. And in Australia and in other countries, right at the beginning, it had lost a lot of support, but most of the support that it lost came after that. if you like. So it wasn't just the mere fact that 5 years had elapsed, in which nothing happened. That didn't lower support quite as much as the subsequent 3 or 4 years, in which lots and lots of things happened over a shorter period of time that made it seem like the Taliban were going to win in Afghanistan. It was going to be a new quagmire. So I would suggest that time and it's very difficult to separate the influence of time and the influence of prospects of success, because I think that one is informative about the other. But I think where they're such that they are separable, I think that it probably is prospects for success that make more of a difference. That would be my own interpretation. But it's hard to reject that in the context of the research design.
I'd actually like to suggest maybe another variable, and that's the nature of the casualties. If you think about the people we've been putting into harm's way, they're not 18-year-old conscripts.
Yeah.
And I think there's what we call the Grand Prix driver effect.
Yeah.
If it's special forces or fighter pilots,
Yeah.
and they're doing what we use being worthwhile, I think that's an important point, and they get killed. I think, frankly, there is this factor about saying those are adult, highly intelligent, highly trained people who've gone in consciously into harm's way, knowing what they're doing. So I think I think our experience for the last decade of who's been going into harm's way is fundamentally different in nature as well as scale to the historical experience in the shadow age.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and it's interesting, by the by, that the Australian public seems to now redefine special forces to not be boots on the ground. So you actually find that the polling support for having Australian ground troops in Afghanistan, there's no majority for that, but there is a majority in favour of having special forces as though they're not actually ground troops, right? And I mean, that does appear to be maddeningly inconsistent, but the fact is that's just what the public's understanding is and the public thinks of things. Yeah, I think that's true, yeah, because I mean, these guys in an awful lot of cases may be doing what they actually want to do. I mean, they're certainly volunteering to do what they do. So, I mean, it's not as controversial perhaps as it would be if we were talking about conscripts. But again, I mean, it's really kind of hard to see. I can't imagine conscription being brought back in Australia anytime in the foreseeable future, or in most other countries either. So, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I don't really know how you can resolve it.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we might have to bring it to a close here. It's my role to give the vote of thanks, but I realised after Charlie's talk that that's a somewhat hard task to do, given that my views suffer from a real selection bias, probably are entirely based on gut feeling as well. So, but I noticed, Charlie, that a lot of Australians probably are starting to feel a bit of poll fatigue in terms of the way that this data is kind of burst and dragging it all over our media. But I think you've kind of really demonstrated the importance of these approaches, and especially when handled well and applied, really kind of analytically examined and applied to new areas, and really providing a fresh voice, even if in many ways it's our own voice being reflected back to us. So can I ask you all to join with me in thanking Charles Miller for presenting the talk tonight. Thank you all very much for coming on.
All right, yeah, good to see you again. How's it going? Yeah, definitely.
Oh, fascinating talk. I really,
Thank you.
really enjoyed it.
Glad to see you guys were able to make it over. I mean, I emailed Jason just a little while ago and said, I was having this talk, and
Oh, that was me.
Oh, yeah, I beg your pardon. Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay. I thought, because you said that you were going to be in Brisbane for the G20.
Yeah, we just got back on Monday.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, the president went wheels up on Sunday evening, and we've been back here for the press business. But I was curious, are your results published? Or
so one of the casualty sensitivity results are published, but the results about ANZUS, I'm going to submit them for publication.
Okay.
I mean, I can let you guys have an advanced copy, providing you're not being the reviewer or anything.
Yeah.
The results about China are under review currently in international organisations. So I mean, if they get published there, I can give you the link. If not, I can send it on to you.
Yeah, let me give you my card again.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you
I
very
would
much.
love to see those, and I was the only one that made it tonight, but
usually see wanting to invite you over to the embassy and have other folks hear the same talk, because this is one of the areas that we constantly struggle with, is how do we maintain contact with the younger generation.
I mean, yeah, I think there's no... I was initially interested in expanding it and looking at, specifically looking at ethnic Australians, so non-Anglos.
Yes.
So I mean, the way that the Australian census, or the way the Australian election study defines ethnicity is very different to how it's done in the United States. It's not self-identification, it's where were your parents born, where were your grandparents born. And basically, this is, I mean, it's really quite a crude measure, and also because there's small numbers, we're not able to kind of break it down by country of ancestry, if you like. So, you know, there may be only 5 or 6 Lebanese Australians, or 5 or so, 30 or so Chinese Australians. It'd be nice to actually get them. The difficulty is actually identifying the target population and then sampling from them, which is, I mean, it's a difficult kind of question to do, but I mean, you know, with sufficient organisational nous, then it's something that is definitely doable. And that's just something, unfortunately, as a lone academic, I really lack. You know? But it'd be interesting to talk to you guys about something along these lines in the future. But thanks an awful lot for
it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. This was great.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll send on the articles to you. And,
great.
Just so you think.
Great.
All right. Thank you. Okay. All the best. Then.
Hi there.
There you go. Thanks.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, no worries.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
And you obviously showed yourself there that the China uprising question isn't a salient issue yet. And when it does become salient, you would expect divergence from your model. From the economic and ethnic grounds.
Possibly, yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. There'd be a possible divergence. And so what I was going to ask is, have you got data, or have you looked at data from before and after an issue has become salient? Because I imagine that a lot of the people who took this survey, I don't know how you took it, but you know, haven't really thought about the question.
Yeah, that's true.
That much, and then when it becomes salient, obviously they are going to spend a little bit more time thinking. So you would expect some sort of movement. You know, maybe a little, maybe your models out the window. I don't know.
Right. Well, there is something that Andrew Davies came up with from when he was writing a report for ASPE, where he was looking at defence spending. So over time with defence spending, during the Cold War, opinion on defence spending tended to be quite constant. It didn't really vary very much. There weren't very many don't knows, because defence was a really salient issue because the Cold War was on. After the Cold War was over, it wasn't so much the support went down, so much as support started to fluctuate really crazily, right? And a lot of don't knows kind of came into the issue. So that's a really good example of how, you know, when an issue is no longer salient, it just starts going like that. Because people will say, is China a military threat? I don't know. I'm like, I don't really. I'm a little racist, so I'll just take, you know, this or that. So it's that's probably the best example of that. So where is it you come from yourself? What's your background?
Oh, so for defence.
Oh, you're from defence. Okay, interesting. No, I mean, it'd be interesting. So like I've written another paper and submitted about public opinion on defence spending. I decided to cut it out from this, but I mean, I can send it over to you if you'd be interested.
That'd be good actually.
So did you have a business card by any chance?
No, don't really.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Okay. What's your name? I could probably find it from Gold or something.
Yes. So Andrew Swan.
Andrew Swan. Is that 2 N's or
just 1 N?
1 N. Okay. Right. I'll send you an email on that case. Okay. Well, nice enough, Andrew. All the best now. Yeah. Thanks for coming along. Not too much of a distinction. Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's a difficult